Roger and Xebec are destined to cross paths for the final time on God Valley, yet the two have arrived on the so-called Island of Fate in pursuit of completely independent goals. And though the two have been shown to be bitter rivals, their current trajectories don't seem to place them on a collision course. Which begs the question, what chain of events could possibly prompt the former Pirate King, aligned with Vice Admiral Garp, to make his stand against a man simply trying to rescue his family from the evil celestial dragons? Is it possible that the battles Sengoku described never truly took place? Could the evil Lord Imu have used his dark magic to possess Xebec and force him to play the devil's game? Or could Xebec, in his sinister heel turn, reveal that the incident on God Valley in truth serves his evil master plan? Rox D. Xebec was the first and perhaps greatest enemy of former Pirate King Goldie Roger, a ruthless and cutthroat pirate who ruled the seas 40 years before the story of One Piece began, in a time known as the Era of Rocks. Xebec's crew was full of pirates who would later go on to develop infamous reputations of their own, including Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, Shakky, Wang Ji, and Silver Axe. Unlike other crews, the Rocks pirates directly targeted the world government, as they pillaged, plundered, and otherwise pilfered their Weasley black guts out until the fateful day of the God Valley incident, a pivotal event erased from the pages of history, which completely reshaped the pirate world. According to the newspapers, Rocks, a rampaging force of evil which no one had been able to stop, was at long last taken down by Vice Admiral Garp, championed as the hero of the Marines. However, the world's papers failed to report that on the island of God Valley, the former Pirate King Gold Roger fought side by side with Garp to protect the celestial dragons and their captives from the bloodthirsty Xebec, whose ambition was to become the world king. In the aftermath, the island of God Valley itself is said to have vanished entirely, and has since been erased from the world's maps. Xebec was previously described as a violent and bloodthirsty pirate, whose reign of terror instilled fear the world over, reviled even by his own crew, and importantly, served as a moral foil to the former Pirate King, a champion of freedom and warrior of liberation in the same mold as Monkey D. Luffy. Yet now that Xebec has made his grand entrance into the narrative through Harald and Loki's flashback, we've been presented with a different figure from the heartless monster we heard about in legend. Moreover, now that the truth behind the incident on God Valley is beginning to unfold, it would seem that the infamous Rox D. Xebec has been largely misunderstood. The brutal instrument of terror pictured in past chapters has been replaced by a man fighting to rescue his friends and family from meeting a grisly fate at the very same despotic rulers Xebec has spent his life at sea trying to unseat from the halls of power. However, even as we gain deeper insight into the mind and motivations of Rox D. Xebec, many mysteries remain about his past as well as his yet unrealized master plan. Further, the fact remains that Xebec's ultimate ambition was to ascend to sit on the empty throne as the newly crowned world king, befitting the title of Roger's greatest foe. We also know that despite the fact that we now have better understanding of the events of the God Valley incident, Roger and Garp, two characters whom we know to be generally moral and upstanding figures, are destined to battle Xebec at the climax of the incident now unfolding on the so-called Island of Fate. Which begs the question, what chain of events could possibly lead the former Pirate King to stand in the way of a man whose sole goal is supposedly to protect his innocent wife and child? Which leads me to simply ask the question, if, despite appearances, the incident on God Valley was orchestrated by Xebec's own hand? What if the Davy clan was used to lure in the world government, such that Xebec could spring his trap and make his bid to claim Imu's crown for himself? In today's video, we'll examine the life and voyage of Rox D. Xebec, and then speculate how the incident on God Valley is going to unfold as the era of Rox reaches its dramatic and bloody conclusion. On the concluding page of chapter 1154, we were at long last introduced to the infamous Rox D. Xebec, who arrived on Elbaph for the first time 48 years before the present, looking for King Harald, whom he had met 8 years earlier during the Reverie. We already knew, prior to this scene, that Loki had desired to join Rox, much like Luffy once wished to become part of Shanks' crew, where Pedro had wished to join Roger. But it was nevertheless surprising to see Xebec suddenly make his grand, full entrance into the series. One of the things Oda aims to achieve is the surprising impact of the turn of the page, to flip to the next page and be suddenly caught by surprise. Here I think he achieves that to great effect through the sudden introduction of Xebec and the Rock's pirates, without much in the way of fanfare or build-up. At this point in time, Xebec is called the future captain of the Rock's pirates, despite having already assembled a small crew. At this point in time, their alliance hadn't yet been formalized under the banner of Xebec's own Jolly Roger, as will be explored in coming chapters. The narration box states that Xebec had a heavy bounty placed on his head for having killed an admiral at the Reverie. Yet, notably, we still haven't seen Xebec's bounty revealed. Nevertheless, we can say it's likely lower than Roger and Whitebeard's final bounties, as Brannu said in Chapter 957 that none had achieved higher bounties in the history of the pirate world than the former Pirate King. Also surprising is the fact that Oda here casually reveals that Xebec is the father of Blackbeard, through external narration. The fact that Xebec is the father of Teach itself isn't surprising. In fact, as I've said in past videos, it's exactly what I was expecting, though to be fair, the clues were fairly obvious in this case. Maybe because it was so widely predicted, Oda didn't feel the need to maintain the mystery, though I suppose he could have saved the reveal for later in the flashback as the God Valley incident begins to unfold. I was also surprised by the facial similarity between Xebec and Teach. It sort of begs the question why Blackbeard wasn't recognized as the son of Xebec by people who were well acquainted with rocks, like Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, and even the world government, especially knowing Xebec had a face-to-face encounter with Imu himself. Then again, in retrospect, Ace looks a lot like a young Gold Roger. In fact, there are a lot of parallels between Ace and Blackbeard, right down to the fact that both seem to have taken their mother's names to publicly hide their relationship to their infamous fathers. Both were also extended warlord invitations without Marine intelligence uncovering the identities of their fathers, Roger and Xebec respectively. It's possible the visual similarity between Blackbeard and Rocks is more apparent to readers than it is to people within the story, but regardless, visual similarity alone isn't enough to verify a familial connection. We don't yet know how the connection between Ace and Roger was ultimately uncovered, but we do know that Marine intelligence hadn't yet discovered the link prior to Ace's invitation to join the Warlords, so we can only assume that Blackbeard's Davy clan lineage wasn't known until after the events of Marineford. Honestly, this is just speculation, but I think it's possible Xebec's facial similarity to Teach was a late decision on Oda's part. While I do believe the relationship between Blackbeard and Xebec was always Oda's intention, the early silhouettes of Xebec in Chapter 957 and 1001 don't perfectly match his final design. It's not at all uncommon for Oda to make those types of changes. Xebec doesn't even wear a captain's coat as he was pictured in both his prior appearances. Essentially, I think Oda only recently made the decision to give Xebec a design so similar to Blackbeard, and thus doubt he really thought through the fact that not only the world government, but also Whitebeard, Kaido, and Linlin could or even should have noticed a connection between Teach and Xebec based on their facial likeness. Or maybe he thought it through and rightly decided that it just doesn't matter all that much. Nearly the entirety of Chapter 1155 is focused on a long conversation between King Harald and Roxy Xebec, with a brief flashback within a flashback cutaway to the events of the Reverie at which the two first met. Through this conversation, we gain some fascinating insight into the character of Roxy Xebec and some of the deepest lore of the One Piece world. The chapter opens in Elbaph's underworld, where Rox and crew first meet Loki. Xebec's ruthlessness is immediately demonstrated by his willingness to hurt a young Loki without hesitation, solely for the purpose of forcing a meeting with Harald. We also learn that Xebec fought with a sword in what seems to be a similar style to Roger. Both seem to use the sword as a conduit for their haki, which in the case of Xebec is likened to a giant hammer or cannonball. We then cut away to the events of the Reverie set 56 years before their present, and 8 years before Xebec and Harald's first meeting on Elbaph. Here we learn that Xebec kidnapped 5 kings, killed an admiral, and most notably invaded the Chamber of Flowers to directly challenge Lord Imu. The narration box states that this anomaly was the first of its kind, and hasn't been repeated since. It's also no surprise that Xebec's confrontation with Imu was never recorded in the pages of history, since Imu himself isn't supposed to exist. Here Xebec proclaims himself a worshipper of Davy Jones, whom we later learn in Chapter 1159 is actually Xebec's own ancestor. We'll talk more about the Davy clan later, but most of the lore about Davy Jones in the One Piece world was first explained over 20 years ago in Chapter 306, in which we first learn about the origins of the Davy backfight, a long-standing tradition said to have originated on the pirate island of Full of Lead in the distant past. Crews compete for members, and even for the very right to sail the Jolly Roger. The background and rules of the Davy back fight were already well understood by Robin and Sanji. For each game played in the Davy back fight, a coin is tossed into the sea as a tribute to Davy Jones himself. Robin explains to Chopper that within the One Piece world, Davy Jones is a pirate from long ago who was cursed by a demon and is now said to live on the sea floor. Hence the coins are thrown down to the depths because Davy Jones is said to keep everything that sinks down to him. As a side note, it's worth mentioning that in the official Viz translation, the name Davy Jones was actually first invoked all the way back in Chapter 33 by Black Cat Pirates member Butchie, who proclaims that they've sent many down to see Davy Jones, referencing the nautical legend of Davy Jones' locker, the hell to which those lost at sea are sent. However, the early Viz volumes inserted a lot of stereotypical pirate terminology which didn't exist in the original Japanese text, so this little bit of foreshadowing of Davy Jones was added unintentionally. In the Volume 38 SBS, Oda further explained to a reader the real-world folklore which served as the underpinnings for Davy Jones in the Davy backfight within the One Piece world. While there is no real-world analog to the Davy backfight, Davy Jones' locker has been a famous nautical legend for centuries. Oda clarifies that numerous permutations of those legends exist, but specifies the version he's used for direct inspiration in One Piece. Oda states, "There once was a lying, no-good pirate named Davy Jones. He was a greedy fellow, famous for shutting his crewmates' belongings and treasure and such into his own locker. Even for a pirate, he was a bad guy, and one day a devil cursed him to live forever on the ocean floor. Since that time, whenever ships, sailors, or treasures sink into the sea, they end up shut in his locker on the ocean floor, and never seen again." It's important to clarify that this passage and the accompanying illustration are not meant to represent the figure of Davy Jones in the One Piece world, but are rather Oda's rendering of the real-world legend of Davy Jones he's drawn on for inspiration. With that said, the rendition of the tale Oda has drawn on, especially when compared with the version of the legend recounted by Robin during the Davy backfight, can tell us a lot about who Davy Jones was or is within the world of One Piece. First, it's interesting to note that elements of this Davy Jones myth from both the real world and within the story world of One Piece seem to have partially inspired the two principal antagonists of the Fishman Island story arc, Vanderdecken the Ninth and Hody Jones. Vanderdecken's ancestor is said to have been forever cursed to wander the sea floor, much like the Davy Jones of legend, for the crime of targeting the Prior Poseidon. Notably, Vanderdecken's descendant captains his ancestor's ship, the Flying Dutchman. Though it's important to remember that real-world legends do not connect this infamous ghost ship to the legend of Davy Jones. Rather, the Pirates of the Caribbean films conflated two independent myths to create the iconic squid-faced villain fought by Captain Jack Sparrow. Interestingly, Hody Jones' given name of Jones also matches that of Davy Jones, which doesn't indicate a familial connection, but could signal a sort of reverence for this legendary figure from the Void Century. I've even speculated that the fishmen themselves, forced to live on the sea floor, could have been born from the curse inflicted on Vanderdecken's ancestor, perhaps connected to the curse of Davy Jones in some capacity. In any case, the curse of Davy Jones is a topic for a separate video, but these connections are interesting and worth noting for the time being. In previous theory videos, I predicted that Joy Boy had a primordial adversary, much in the same way Luffy is opposed by Teach in the present, and Roger once faced Rock's Xebec. It seems that Davy Jones may finally provide a name for this hypothetical character. Further, in my most recent theory video, I suggested that Joy Boy may have been a member of the race of buccaneers, that he may have even sailed as a privateer under the Nerona crown, and that his downfall may have been caused by an internal schism among the pirating world, with Joy Boy perhaps even betrayed by a close ally or crewmate. Given all that we've been told about Davy Jones thus far, he seems like a prime candidate to fill that role of moral foil and potentially even traitor to Joy Boy. On a somewhat related note, going all the way back to when Impel Down and Rainford were first being published, I always wondered if there was perhaps something more to Blackbeard's plan than has yet been revealed. Specifically, I always thought it was strange that as far as we've been told, Blackbeard didn't break into Impel Down with any particular target in mind. We know that the primary reason Teach wanted a warlord position in the first place was so that he could leverage that title into infiltrating the world government's greatest prison. But Teach only walked away with a small handful of new allies, none of whom, aside from San Juan Wolf, even possessed Devil Fruit at that point in time. Blackbeard didn't even know about Shiryu, his most powerful new crew member acquired in Impel Down, prior to the break-in. and ultimately the two were only prompted to join forces by an unexpected twist of fate. It's also important to remember that Blackbeard's original plan was to capture Luffy in order to negotiate acceptance into the Warlords, so turning over Ace and instigating the war with Whitebeard was all a happy accident. Of course, we know that much like Luffy, Blackbeard has been guided by the hand of fate, but even with that in mind, his Machiavellian scheme to infiltrate Impel Down seems like too much risk with too little in the way of guaranteed payoff. So just to throw out a theory, what if Teach was indeed looking for something or someone specific when he broke into the prison? Perhaps one on a hidden level below the eternal hell of level 6. Impel Down is patterned on the Inferno in Dante's Divine Comedy, the bottom level of which is reserved for the devil and the great traitors like Brutus, Cassius, and Judas Iscariot. We also know that level 6 of Impel Down sits just above the bedrock of the seafloor, but surely such a massive stone structure would require some subterranean support system, with potentially even a basement level mirroring the bottom ring of the Inferno. This could make even more sense when we consider the messianic imagery Oda has attached to Joy Boy, or Davy Jones a traitor to the world's first pirate, his being imprisoned, cursed to reside forever on the seafloor, in a similar manner to Judas in Dante's Divine Comedy, could make a lot of sense. In the past, I've speculated that Blackbeard's body may be unusual as described by Marco because he contains more than one soul inside him, perhaps Xebec and even Davy Jones himself. Maybe the acquisition of the Darkness Logia and the invasion of Impel Down were all part of Teach's master plan to liberate or reconnect with this ancestral member of the Davy clan. It could even explain why Teach was illustrated with a full row of teeth in chapter 581, why he covered himself and Whitebeard with a dark cloth when he absorbed his former captain's devil fruit, and could have even been foreshadowed all the way back in Mocktown when Luffy and Zoro referred to Blackbeard as them. Of course, all of this is theory and speculation, and again, the curse of Davy Jones is a topic for a separate video. So returning to the scene in chapter 1155, Rock's abducted 5 kings, though we don't yet know what happened to them. He doesn't seem to have them with him, but we don't know of any other crew members accompanying him in the Holy Land at this point in time. Accordingly, the fate of these missing monarchs remains uncertain. The Chamber of Flowers is referred to as the very core of the Holy Land, which was itself referred to as the center of the world. It would therefore make sense if the top of the yet unseen Sunlight Tree Eve can be found in this mysterious chamber. Imu dismisses the abduction of the 5 kings as completely inconsequential, which doesn't seem to surprise Xebec in the slightest, indicating he has full knowledge of the entity with whom he's dealing. Rox then ominously declares, "I will be back right here." This line struck me as highly reminiscent of Roger telling Rayleigh before his execution, "I won't die, partner." Even if Xebec is dead, his will lives on, and that which he embodies will someday return to challenge Imu. Notably, we don't yet know how Xebec possesses knowledge of Imu's existence. Moreover, Xebec seems to know he's completely powerless to topple Imu at the time of their confrontation, but declares his intent to return once he acquires that which he believes is necessary to unseat the world's secret king. In the past, I've speculated that Teach's inability to sleep may be representative of a curse passed down for the crimes of his ancestor, particularly because of the symbolic importance of dreams throughout the story of One Piece. Teach is unable to sleep and thus unable to truly dream, and perhaps this means that the Davy clan never forgot that which is recorded in the true history. Much as the 5 elders know all that happened during the Void Century, it's possible the Davy clan, by some means, have passed down this knowledge as well without need of the poneglyphs. Or maybe they've somehow managed to directly preserve and pass down the memories of Davy Jones himself, which reveal Imu's identity, ultimate goal, and the means by which he may ultimately be defeated. Interestingly, Xebec is holding a pistol when he infiltrates the Chamber of Flowers, which seems to match the style of those used to declare the start of the Davy backfight. Perhaps Xebec intends this as a symbolic challenge to Imu, particularly if a bargain struck between Davy Jones and the demon now occupying the empty throne is related to the origins of the Davy backfight during the Void Century. It's an interesting parallel that villains within the One Piece world who fashion themselves as divine or superior beings often turn their acts of violence and conquest into games. Eneru on Skypiea, Doflamingo on Dressrosa, and of course the Holy Knights. It's interesting then that the Davy backfight, a twisted and cruel pirate game, emerged from the pirating world, presumably created by Davy Jones or his descendants. It speaks to the idea that Xebec's desire to become World King is ideologically and ethically similar to the World Nobles, and runs counter to the intended spirit of the Jolly Roger. One last notable detail about this scene is the presence of Gunko, as Imu's maidservant. Gunko is later described as the devoted blade of God, suggesting she may have some special connection or pact with Imu, which allows her to be possessed directly. As Xebec makes his escape, he clashes with Harald, and though we don't actually see the sky split, potentially because of Marijoi's altitude, their crossing blades is nevertheless similar to previous clashes between top-tier warriors like the Four Emperors. It can thus be reasonably assumed that King Harald was on the same level of strength as some of the most powerful warriors in the One Piece world. Over the next 8 years, Rox would go on to rise in infamy as he caused havoc all across the seas, and began to assemble his crew by way of Davy backfight. This explains why pirates with such contrasting ideals all assembled under Rock's Jolly Roger. It seems Whitebeard may have been his first recruit, though we can't say for certain. We previously learned that backing out of or refusing to acknowledge the results of a Davy backfight is seen as one of the greatest disgraces a pirate can endure. Accordingly, those who sail with Rox are bound by their own sense of honor to acknowledge him as their captain. Unlike Luffy and Roger, whose crews cooperate to achieve their individual dreams, the members of Rox are forcibly subjugated to the will of their captain. Perhaps significantly, Xebec's bounty poster bears a striking resemblance to Buggy's current poster after becoming Emperor of the Sea. While Buggy certainly fits the Morganeer archetype and remains intent on discovering the treasure of former Rox pirate member Captain John, it's unclear if there could be some deeper connection between Xebec and Buggy. Rox, unlike other pirates, directly targets the world government right from the outset, which again begs the question of exactly how much Xebec knows about the world's forgotten history. This all leads to the first arrival of Rock's crew on Elbaph 48 years before the present, during which Xebec first pitches an alliance with Harald. The initial lineup of Rocks at this point in time includes Whitebeard, Miss Buchan, Golden Lion Shakky, Gonzui, Don Marlin, and Wang Zhi. We're already well acquainted with Whitebeard and Miss Buchan, referred to as the Science Robber, though the backstory of the latter will likely be explored in greater depth whenever we next follow up on the story of Marco rescuing Weevil. Wang Zhi was first mentioned in Chapter 957, and was recently revealed to have retained control of Pirate Island until it was seized by Blackbeard 1 year before the present during the Rocky Port incident. He's referred to as Pirate Guru, which could suggest he has primarily served as an advisor or informant to other pirates. Golden Lion Shakky, revealed here to have previously been a mobster, of course served as the primary antagonist of the film Strong World, though those events don't really fit with the actual canon. Nevertheless, Shikky's backstory from the film and Chapter 0 remains canon. Only his present whereabouts remain unknown in the true manga canon storyline. We know Gonzui is dead, as his corpse was first seen on Thriller Bark as one of Moria's zombie generals, though this is the first time we've learned his name. He was said to have been a pirate smuggler, perhaps connecting him to the criminal underworld. Lastly, Don Marlin is the only member of Rox newly introduced in Chapter 1155. He's said to be a gangster from the West Blue, which leads me to believe he was previously head of one of the 5 families, later consolidated under Captain Capone. Interestingly, among Rock's initial lineup, most of them seem to have originated from the criminal underworld, which makes sense as Xebec's crew aren't even formally distinguished as the Rock's pirates by this point in time. Further, he later tells Harald that the Davy clan have ties to the underworld, which could explain how he first made some of these connections. Harald of course rejects Xebec's invitation and warns his crew that disaster awaits if they remain a part of Rox, but Shakky reiterates that they're merely a collective of individuals, bound by no genuine friendship or loyalty. At the heart of Xebec and Harald's disagreement are their contrasting views of the world government. Where Xebec is directly trying to dismantle the world government, Harald maintains what could be described as a naive or overly optimistic stance on what it means for Elbaph to join this global organization. Harald thinks it will elevate Elbaph to stand on equal footing with other nations, and that it will erase what he describes as the giant's barbaric reputation. Xebec, by contrast, doesn't believe people's nature can change, and thus implores Harald to embrace his warrior heritage by joining the fight against the world government. Ultimately, the truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Harald we met 109 years ago was indeed barbaric, as he pillaged and plundered to his heart's content without any concern for the collateral damage. Yet this begs the question whether Elbaph needs to fully reject its warrior past in order to form diplomatic ties with the outside world, especially when we readers know that a war great enough to split the seas in two awaits in order to bring about the world's new dawn. Ultimately, We also know that Harald is going to meet an untimely fate as he becomes entangled with the world nobles. So Xebec and Jarul aren't wrong in their warnings. Perhaps then Elbaph need not reject its strength, but rather refocus the way that strength is utilized. Here we also learn a great deal about the lure of full-lead Hachinoso or Pirate Island. It's said that countries around the world ship out their hardened criminals and exile them on what's believed to be a deserted island, without food or water. Yet some time ago, a gold lode was discovered under the island. Thus, the criminals exiled to Pirate Island made a fortune through their underworld connections, and thus started to build themselves a nation of outlaws. Xebec thus plans to convince the world government he'll retake full lead on their behalf for a price, but instead will use those funds to further expand his crew. Of course, he has no intention of turning over full lead, but instead to turn it into the so-called pirate's paradise it's now become in the present. Oda made a point to remind us that the Davy backfight was invented on Pirate Island long before the start of Rocks, and thus we know that even before it became an international Alcatraz, Hachinoso, or Full Lead, was already an island inhabited by pirates. In fact, I wonder if rulership of the island, or the gold lode beneath it, could have been the 30 pieces of silver Joy Boy's trader received during the Void Century, assuming some of my earlier speculation is correct, and again, returning to the messianic imagery. Xebec rightly seems to diagnose many of the abuses of power perpetrated by the world government, which makes his desire to dismantle the Marines and bring the Holy Land to its knees sound almost noble. After all, we know that these celestial dragons are truly awful, and that the world is likely secretly under the control of a true devil. Yet Xebec's own naked ambition is also made clear, as he declares his intent to become world king in Imu's place. Ironically, he tells Harald that no authority in the world lasts forever. But by this same logic, his own dominion, were his plan successful, would be similarly fleeting. In this light, his invitation for Harald to reject the world government appears far more self-serving, as he too intends to take advantage of Harald and Elbaph's strength for his own personal gain. Rock's belief that people are incapable of change is also contrary to the central themes of the series, as we've seen that even evil celestial dragons like Mio's Guard are capable of dramatic transformation. Oda has said that the reason Luffy's enemies don't die is because their errant dreams and ambitions are instead shattered. The other side of this is that once their ambitions are crushed, this opens up the potential for transformation, and subsequently new beginning. Ultimately, Xebec's cynical view is likely passed down to Blackbeard, and thus will someday be challenged by Luffy as the two fight to inherit the title of Pirate King. As Chapter 1155 closes, we learn that 4 years later, Xebec's alliance would formally brand themselves the Rocks Pirates, and at last set his plan in motion to seize control of Full Lead. Chapter 1156 begins with what appears to be a complete detour into Kuja Pirates' lore, though as we'll soon find out, this is really the beginning of our setup for the God Valley incident. Essentially, this chapter reveals that the pirating world of the Rocks era boils down to one giant love triangle. Gloriosa loved Roger, Roger loved Shakky, and Shakky loved Rayleigh. And as it turns out, even Figureland Garling had set his sights on the most famous idol sailing the blue seas, which would ultimately set the incident on God Valley in motion several years later. We next learn that after failing to convince Harald to join his crew over a 4-year time span, the Rocks Pirates fully took control of Full Lead 44 years before the present, just over 4 years after Xebec first arrived on Elbaph. Notably, the giant skull which serves as Pirate Island's defining geographical feature doesn't yet have eyes, and thus is instead said to resemble a giant fish. This may not ultimately mean anything, but the shape of Full Lead's mountain seems to be artificially constructed, which means that making a fish-shaped island may have been the original intention centuries earlier. The only thing I can think is that maybe there's some connection to Oda's fish-shaped self-portrait, but honestly I think that's pretty unlikely. We then see Xebec blast open 2 holes in the side of the mountain, transforming what was a giant fish into the skull shape we're now familiar with, though this introduces a fairly significant timeline discontinuity. We previously saw Kaido's first arrival on Full Lead through his mini-flashback in Chapter 1049. He first sought to join Rocks 44 years ago, likely shortly after Rocks took control of the island, at which point in time, it already resembled a skull. Yet here, in Chapter 1156, Kaido is already shown to be a member of Rock's crew when Xebec opens up the island's eyes. Usually these types of errors are corrected on the volume release, but in this case, it would require going back and amending volume 103, so I'm not entirely sure Oda would bother doing so. The lineup of rocks has now expanded to include Charlotte Linlin, Strucin, Captain John, Barbell, Kaido, and Silver Axe Kyo over the 4 years between chapters 1155 and 1156. As noted, Kaido only recently joined after the takeover of Full Lead was complete. We don't know when or how Big Mom, Strucin, Kaido, and Barbell were recruited, but presumably their strength was instrumental in helping Rocks seize control of Pirate Island. Barbell was first seen in the background of chapter 1096, but this is the first time we learn his name. Solely based on his name, I wonder if he could be related to Sunbell, also a fishman and member of the Roger Pirates. Notably, while most of the original lineup seen in chapter 1155 originated from the underworld, this batch of new recruits are mostly pirates. It's interesting that Oda dedicated a full page to the introduction of Mobster Kyo, said to be a rival of Golden Lion Shiki. Though this is the first time he's actually appeared on panel, we were previously told by Sengoku in chapter 957 that Silver Axe would go on to become infamous in his own right after the fall of Rocks, much like Kaido, Big Mom, Whitebeard, Wangji, Captain John, and his rival, Golden Lion Shiki. Thus far, he's the only one besides Kaido we have seen actively seek to join Rocks. Silver Axe and Barbell are also the only former Rocks Pirates members whose fates are completely unknown. While he hasn't been a particularly prominent character in this flashback, it's still possible he could re-emerge in the present. Now that Rocks has successfully taken control of Pirate Island, we learn some key details about the next phase of his plan. First, we find out that Xebec was pursuing 2 devil fruit, one of which he rightly assumes will be found on Elbaph. Again, the question of how Xebec has uncovered these secrets remains a mystery, but we know this mysterious devil fruit was kept as a treasure in Orist Castle until the fateful day 14 years ago when it was eaten by Loki. Interestingly, Xebec believed this fruit would only reach its full potential if it was wielded by King Harald. Xebec didn't want to eat this fruit for himself, but rather wanted Harald to consume the fruit and then use its power to support the cause of Rocks. This also suggests that unlike Blackbeard, Xebec was, at least at this time, not able to eat more than 1 devil fruit. This leaves us with a couple key questions. First, is it possible Xebec shared the same erroneous belief as Loki that Elbaph's devil fruit makes him the sun god of legend? Or did he fully understand the fruit's true nature and want it for that reason? Second, what exactly is this devil fruit? This question will likely be answered later in the flashback when we return to the fateful day of Harald's death, but it's also a mystery how exactly this power may be utilized to achieve Rock's ultimate goal. I don't have any concrete theories of what this fruit might be, though something rooted in Norse mythology, particularly something related to Loki or his 3 children responsible for bringing about Ragnarok, could make a lot of sense. Loki's hammer Ragnir seems to merge the word Ragnarok with the name of the wolf Fenrir, though its power to summon lightning seems closer to the mythological Thor. Ragnir also seems to be hidden away in Elbaph's treasure vault, so I think its lightning power may be independent from Loki's devil fruit. I'm thinking that the hammer itself has been infused with the devil fruit power, explaining how it could be activated even when Loki remains shackled with sea stone. Alternatively, just speculating, but I wonder if Loki confused his power with that of sun god Nika because his power is derived from a Paramethea type Nika Nika fruit. I don't know Japanese, so I can't offer an expert opinion here, but as far as I've been able to tell, Nika can be read to mean either smile or second bloom in Japanese. A Nika fruit based on the word smile could fit with the imagery of Loki as a trickster archetype, a Joker-type character whose deceptive tactics are signaled by a twisted grin. In that sense, it could be viewed as a type of anti-Nika fruit, one which brings joy to its wielder at the expense of others, contrasted by Nika, which stretches smiles across the face of other people. The second bloom interpretation or meaning could also potentially fit Norse myth. After the fabled Battle of Ragnarok, the world tree Yggdrasil is prophesied to be destroyed, with a new sapling taking its place. Loki and his devil fruit are foretold to be pivotal in bringing about the end of the current world in a manner similar to Loki's role in Norse myth, instigating Ragnarok. So perhaps his devil fruit could have a power pertaining to the new beginning which follows. It also could have a metaphorical meaning, just like Robin's devil fruit, the Hana Hana no Mi. Perhaps second bloom could mean resurrection, fitting Loki's daughter Hel from Norse mythology, the queen of the underworld. We also learn through this scene that locating and reviving the Galila band is somehow instrumental to Xebec's goal. So perhaps Loki's devil fruit is based on his mythological namesake's daughter Hel, queen of the damned in Norse mythology. A necromantic devil fruit power capable of raising the dead could serve Xebec's interests, and was perhaps modeled by Moria using his devil fruit power to resurrect ores on Thriller Bark. Notably, Xebec is also seeking a second devil fruit power, presumably for himself. It's possible that he was seeking the Darkness Logia that Blackbeard ultimately discovered in the hands of Thatch. It would certainly fit with the idea that Xebec's son has inherited his will and is carrying out his unfulfilled ambition. But it's hard to say for certain, as Blackbeard may still be seeking a third devil fruit for himself, perhaps one which eluded Xebec's grasp 40 years earlier. Of course, it's also possible Xebec understood the true nature of the Gomu Gomu fruit and thus was seeking to obtain Nika's power, a quest doomed to failure since Nika has a will of its own to choose its wielder. However, fitting with the idea that Xebec is carrying on the will of Davy Jones, potentially Joy Boy's Void Sentry pirate adversary, I think it's less likely that Rox was seeking out Joy Boy's power rather than the devil fruit which serves as a direct counterpart to Nika. Xebec says that Elbaph is the key to taking down the Holy Land, matching Imu's belief that the Giants will play a pivotal role in determining the outcome of the war now brewing in the One Piece world. Xebec also remains surprisingly loyal to Harald when Kaido suggests that Rox forcibly bring Elbaph under heel. Big Mom already alludes to having underworld connections, potentially through Streusen, whose origins remain mysterious, but says her network hasn't yet located Galila. Interestingly, if the frozen giants on Punk Hazard are indeed Elbaph's lost army of shipwrights, Big Mom later strikes a deal with Caesar, who has access to said army. At the close of chapter 1156, Xebec declares that he will show his crew the peak of the world if they stand by him and help him achieve his goals, fitting with his ambition to become world king. But interestingly, he also tells them that it's up to them whether or not they want to follow him on the fateful day of their mission. Of course, this could allude to a fateful day that never arrived, especially given what we learn in the next few chapters about the motivations behind God Valley. But alternatively, I wonder if this could signal that all is not as it seems, and that the events staged to unfold on the so-called Island of Fate align with Xebec's ambition. Could the God Valley incident be the fateful day Xebec proclaimed to his followers, and one orchestrated by his own design? In the opening scene of chapter 1157, the Rox pirates fight among themselves while raiding the Bezel International Charity before their escape route is blocked by the Marines, who arrive far sooner than expected, which provides our first hint that there's a traitor among Rox feeding intel to the government, which is no real surprise given their animosity toward one another. My initial suspicion that Wang Xi was the rat seems to have been more overtly verified in later chapters, but the very fact that he emerges from the Rox era as the ruler of Pirate Island suggests his complicity in Rox's ultimate demise. In that context, Blackbeard's conquering of Pirate Island could even be reframed as an act of vengeance against a former crewmate who betrayed his father Xebec. It also makes me wonder if a dark fate awaits Caribou should he prove to be the son of the man who betrayed Blackbeard's father Xebec. We next learn that within 2 years of their founding, Rox carried out 16 raids, sunk 76 ships, burned 14 ports, leveled 5 towns, brought 1 kingdom to ruin, committed 3 special violations of Article 18 of World Law, and perpetrated 25 additional crimes which have been completely covered up. While this is mostly just flavor text, it does introduce a couple of interesting questions. First, regarding the 5 towns leveled, it seems like a strong possibility one was the village from which the people of Orangetown and the East Blue originated. Whoopslap told the Straw Hats that their previous town was destroyed by pirates roughly 40 years ago, or 42 years ago now after the time skip, which not so coincidentally places it right in the middle of the era of Rox. Additionally, I'm curious about the kingdom Rox brought to ruin. Perhaps this could be relevant for a future storyline. Again, there's probably no real significance to the particular statute cited here, but I'm curious about what constitutes international world law and what special violations were committed by the Rox pirates. Similarly, I'm curious about the 25 crimes which were completely covered up. Presumably, these were incidents which directly challenged the world government or celestial dragons in some way, much like the Straw Hats' involvement in incidents like Alabasta have been completely covered up, or misrepresented in the case of Egghead. On that note, the World Economic Journal wildly distorts the incident which unfolds on the island of Anishi in the New World, where Harald defends the people of an unaffiliated country which, according to a ruthless cypherpole agent, has no rights in the eyes of the world government. Harald willingly sets back his own dream of allying Elbaph to the world government to defend friends who helped feed his starving kingdom years earlier. Yet Morgan's headline in the world's leading tabloid sensationalizes the story to fearmonger against the giants, claiming that Harald has shown his true stripes, though you'd think the World Economic Journal's readers would recognize the oxymoron in the phrase innocent worship used to describe the world government's blockade. Nevertheless, Xebec points to this incident as even more proof of his claim that Elbaph will never be truly accepted in the eyes of the world. He again makes salient points in his conversation with Harald when he says that bowing and scraping before the world government's evil rulers won't prosper Elbaph, but it's also important to take a step back and recognize that while Xebec addresses real issues, his prescribed remedy is seizing totalitarian power for himself and being crowned world king. He also hasn't told Harald the truth about why he wants the devil fruit in Elbaph's possession, so at least on some level, Xebec is still trying to deceive Harald. Xebec may be right about the world government, but that doesn't make him a good guy, nor does it make his actions any more moral or just, which Ida correctly recognizes when she cautions Harald to choose better friends. Oda's writing is nuanced, and from the very outset he hasn't shied away from the moral complexity of this world of pirates, so it's no surprise that both Harald and Xebec's perspectives are well-reasoned and well-argued. It's always been my firm belief that the world government represents the primary antagonistic force of the series, so all the things Xebec says are true, and Harald's optimism is framed as overly naive. Where Harald hopes to effect change from within, Xebec seeks to tear down the entire system to its foundation. Where Xebec wants to eradicate the Marines, Harald counters that the vast majority of soldiers are fighting with good intentions to protect others, and that as a whole, the world government's military arm fights to uphold justice. And again, both have a valid point. The One Piece world is overrun by pirates, and the average Marine is just trying to protect their friends and family. And we've even been introduced to many morally righteous Marine characters like Kobe, Smoker, Tashigi, and Fujitora, who do what's right even when it means standing up to their superiors. Yet those like Inu, who have risen to the top ranks of their organization, hold to the totalitarian view of so-called absolute justice, aligning with the values of the world nobles. Ultimately, the actions of the Marines serve to uphold the tyranny of the Celestial Dragons, who exploit and worsen the lives of people in the One Piece world, which may be the very reason that piracy itself exists to promote freedom, exploited by some like Blackbeard and Xebec to do evil, thereby driving up Marine recruitment, all perpetuating a vicious cycle. Xebec fails to recognize that pirates like himself, who care little for the wake of terror and destruction they leave behind, only serve to dilute the true power of the Jolly Roger to unite the world in pursuit of freedom from tyrants like the world nobles. All this is worth keeping in mind as we approach both the God Valley incident within this flashback and the climactic final war in the broader narrative of One Piece. Piracy as a vehicle to pursue freedom can be a force for good, and a catalyst for positive change, as was likely Joy Boy's intention as the world's first pirate. Yet those like Blackbeard and Xebec, who abuse said freedom to selfishly pursue their own goals without concern for collateral damage, ultimately perpetuate a vicious cycle of hatred and vengeance, as those acts of violence and destruction breed fear, which in turn is preyed upon by tyrants like the world nobles to prop up their totalitarian regime. On that note, I have no real basis for this theory beyond the fact that the dates may line up, but I wonder if the admiral killed by Rock's Xebec could have been Akainu's father. The reverie at which Xebec killed an admiral took place 56 years ago, and Sakazuki is currently 55 years old. It's possible he was born shortly after his father's death, and accordingly, his deep hatred of pirates and sense of absolute justice could have been at least partially caused by Xebec's act of violence. Again, however, I have to emphasize this is entirely speculation. Returning to Full Lead, we learn that in the 2 years since the island was conquered, former Kuja Pirates captain Gloriosa has now joined Rocks, though we don't know whether this was a choice made of her own volition or one forced by way of Davy backfight. Given Gloriosa's love for Roger, it would be a bit odd for her to intentionally join the crew of his greatest rival. According to Big Mom, Gloriosa quit to chase a man, presumably Roger, so leaving the Kuja was her decision, but we don't know how that led her to Rocks. In that time, Shakky took over as captain, but she too stood down 42 years ago. It turns out that her tenure as Empress of the Kuja was short-lived, lasting less than 2 years. We see young Katakuri, Oven, and Daifuku alongside Big Mom as she and Gloriosa discuss the news about Shakky, which confirms that prior to the establishment of Totland, the Charlotte children likely grew up on Pirate Island. Continuing the trend of there being a surprising amount of relationship drama on the seas during the Reign of Rocks, we see that Miss Buchan's affection for Whitebeard was entirely one-sided, making it even more clear that her already extremely implausible claim that he fathered Weevil is completely false. This leads into what is described as one of the most shocking days in the history of Pirate Island, as Shakky arrives to establish the first iteration of her famous rip-off bar. Given just how famous Shakky was the world over during the Reign of Rocks, and the fact that her infamous establishment came to be known as the Jewel of Pirate Island, I have to wonder how she remained so far under the radar on Sabaody 40 years later, while still using the same exact name. We here see the first reference to Shakky as the treasure of Pirate Island we previously learned had been stolen and brought to God Valley, but it was surprising to learn that she played such a pivotal role in the incident which completely reshaped the pirate world and brought the era of Rocks to a close. Chapter 1157 then closes on the 5 elders in the Hall of Power, where they hand down the order that if Harald and the giants of Elbaph kill Rocks D. Xebec, they will be permitted to join the world government. Just as Xebec warned, the world government's leaders only value the giants for their strength, and will only acknowledge the kingdom of Elbaph insofar as it benefits their own interests. In this case, bringing about the end of Rocks. At the start of chapter 1158, we learn that Shakky's reason for stepping down as Empress was indeed due to lovesickness, with Rayleigh as the object of her affection. This news comes to the Roger pirates while sailing on a certain stretch of sea, potentially closing in on Lodestar Island given the timeline. Meanwhile, a short time earlier, 40 years before the present, we see Garling inform the elders that he made an unexpected discovery on the unaffiliated island of God Valley, while working on a separate matter, and accordingly urges the elders to make God Valley the site of the Celestial Dragon's next manhunt. While we previously learned that this barbaric event took place during the God Valley incident through Kuma's flashback, we here learn that the location was selected by Garling. I'm also curious to know more about this separate matter Garling was working on in the West Blue, which led him to discover the Davy clan on God Valley. We know that he fathered Shanks and Shamrock with a yet unnamed woman on God Valley, which begs the question if this was somehow related to Garling's mission or his discovery of the Davy clan. Interestingly, Garling says that God Valley had what he described as a unique culture, and extended them an invitation to join the world government, but failed to secure an agreement. Beyond his discovery of the Davy clan, Garling also states that the island is rich in natural resources which could benefit the world government. We next return to Shakky's bar on Pirate Island, where she recognizes Xebec has fallen in love with someone. Big Mom and Gloriosa seem to share Shakky's keen intuition, while Whitebeard remains oblivious. When Roger arrives on the scene, Xebec angrily asks how many times he has to tell Roger that Pirate Island belongs to him. This indicates that either Roger has repeatedly intruded on Xebec's territory, or that ownership of Pirate Island has repeatedly been a point of contention between the Rocks and Roger pirates. We also see that even at this early stage in their voyage, Roger enjoyed a friendly rivalry with Whitebeard, and was disappointed when Newgate left the bar before the two could share a drink. While the scene on full lead is mostly comedic, we see that Roger and Xebec had a much more bitter rivalry when out at sea. On that note, reiterating a point discussed earlier, much of this flashback has shown Xebec in a sympathetic light, even if it hasn't all been positive. This, coupled with the fact that Xebec's indictments against the world government have been mostly on point, has led to the impression that Xebec has been simply misunderstood or misrepresented. But it's important to remember that Roger and Rocks were moral foils, with the former much more closely sharing the Straw Hat's sense of justice. Following up on the cliffhanger from chapter 1157, with the turn of a page we suddenly jump back to Elbaph, in the middle of a dramatic battle between Xebec and Harald. I was surprised that there wasn't more build-up to this conflict, though it does make for an impactful page turn, and there's so much ground to cover that Oda probably didn't want to spend extra panel time on a prolonged battle when the part that really matters is the dramatic dissolution of Harald and Xebec's unorthodox friendship. Equally surprising is Harald's decision to carry out the world government's requirement that he kill Xebec without any further coercion. Harald says that he struggled with the decision, and as I've touched on several times, Xebec isn't a good guy. But he and Harald are still friends, and thus this represents a significant betrayal. Even though Xebec is a villainous character when contrasted with more upstanding pirates like Roger, he still adheres to a sort of pirate's code, even while captaining a crew like Rock's. There is genuine pain on Xebec's face when he asks Harald if he's willing to kill a friend to achieve his vision for Elbaph's future as a member state of the world government. I've spent time earlier in this video emphasizing the fact that despite his correct assessment of the evils of the world government, Xebec is himself morally compromised. Both his goals and his methods of achieving those goals are deeply flawed, and don't align with the values of those like Luffy, Roger, and Joy Boy. But Harald here crosses a major ethical and moral line by agreeing to execute a friend on the world government's behalf. Especially knowing that the government is ruled by a true devil, Xebec is completely right that the elders are using Harald without him even realizing he's being manipulated. Xebec tells Harald that the government only views the giants as a military force to be harnessed, and cautions that if he continues down his path, his nation will be enslaved and called soldiers. Xebec's words here may be rooted in personal experience or knowledge of the history of the Davy clan. I think there's a good chance that Joy Boy was a buccaneer, and given the real-world history of buccaneers, it's entirely possible their race were used and then later enslaved and tossed aside in a manner similar to what Xebec tells Harald the giants might endure. In chapter 1160, it's later suggested that the Davy clan are also buccaneers, though that's not confirmed. I suppose it's possible that if Davy Jones was initially an ally of Joy Boy, then he too could have been a buccaneer. If so, maybe their falling out was preceded by an ideological divide similar to the one between Harald and Xebec. Xebec asks Harald where his warrior pride has gone, to which Harald responds that Elbaph's history of violence from when they called themselves warriors has been nothing but a shackle. I think this exchange speaks to the fact that Xebec and Harald are two of the most morally complex characters Oda has written, as both have almost noble but flawed aspirations. Both make valid points, but neither perfectly hits the mark. Xebec is right that the world government is an evil, tyrannical force, but his vicious tactics and ambition to crown himself world king compromises that message. Similarly, Harald's desire for Elbaph to reform and connect the giants with the outside world, rather than continue their path of pillaging and plundering, offers his people a positive vision for their future. Yet betraying and attempting to kill a man he calls a friend, even one as deeply flawed as Xebec, shows that Harald too is morally and ethically compromised. To quote Uncle Ben, "With great power comes great responsibility," and while Harald is right to recognize that Elbaph hasn't wielded its power wisely, the innate strength possessed by the giants isn't inherently a curse. The One Piece world awaits liberation, and the world government Harald is trying so desperately to join is ruled by what appears to be a true devil. Elbaph can reform without completely abandoning its warrior past. The giants of Elbaph, much like Kaido, historically sought glory through conquest and combat. However, wars don't make one great, and thus the desire to achieve greatness through battle for its own sake is folly. But strength can also be wielded for good, especially when the world is ruled by an evil tyrannical entity. Of course, this analysis is all coming from an outside perspective as a reader who can look at the bigger picture. We know a global war awaits, and that the giants will need to play an instrumental role in the world's liberation. So, as much as the giants may be better suited to construction rather than destruction, it's too soon for Elbaph to completely abandon its warrior ways. One of the first lessons Luffy learned from Shanks was when to walk away from a battle that isn't worth fighting. Shanks didn't lift a finger against a nobody like Akuma solely for the sake of his own ego. Yet later, when Luffy's life was on the line, Shanks didn't hesitate to use his strength to intervene against that same bandit Higuma. That is to say, a corollary to this lesson Luffy learned from Shanks is that there is a time when strength is necessary. Elbaph is the mightiest nation in the One Piece world, and for good or bad, that strength will someday be called upon. Rather than trying to shake off Elbaph's strength, Harald should instead be trying to decide how that strength will be utilized. King Harald may also be compared to a character like Kozuki Oden, both regarded as heroes in their insular societies, whose views on the outside world were transformed by a voyage out to sea. Both were also flawed characters whose mistakes compromised the safety and sovereignty of their nations and their people. Yet Harald still strikes me as a character with deeper flaws, in that not only has he made errors of judgment, but his very ambition might be erroneous. Oden wanted to open Wano's borders in preparation for Joy Boy's return, and though that time hasn't yet arrived, it was nevertheless a necessary step to bringing the dawn to Wano. Odin may have been a bit premature, but his desire to open the borders also wasn't directly responsible for his demise. Rather, the Kurozumi grudge was already bubbling under the surface for decades for persecution that took place under Sukiyaki's reign as shogun, rather than Odin's, and Kaido had already arrived on Wano by the time Odin returned from his voyage. It's also important to remember that while Odin first set sail for the sheer joy of adventure, the last leg of his voyage, which delayed his return home, during which he decoded the poneglyphs and guided Roger to Laugh-Tale, was a choice Odin made to answer the call of destiny. Harald is similar in that his desire for Elbaph to set aside its ways of war in favor of construction is most likely simply premature. The Giants of Elbaph will play a pivotal role not only in the war for liberation, but also the construction of a new world and its aftermath. At the same time, Harald's method of achieving his goal is also compromised, in that he's seeking to do so by joining the world government, the very entity which currently oppresses the One Piece world and is ruled by Elbaph's ancient enemy. On that tragic note, Xebec and Harald's unusual friendship comes to a close, and the two wouldn't see each other again until the day of the God Valley incident 2 years later. Chapter 1159 continues our build-up to the God Valley incident, as we learn on the opening page that 39 years ago Shakky was kidnapped, or as we were told in Chapter 1096, the treasure of Pirate Island was stolen by the world government. Notably, we see that living up to his name, Don Marlin now sleeps with the fishes, as he was killed during the incursion. We also see that as the rest of not only Pirate Island, but the entire world mourns the disappearance of Shakky, Wang Ji greedily flips through a stack of berries we can only assume to be a bribe paid by Shakky's captors to gain access to Pirate Island. I already discussed at length the possibility of Wang Ji being a rat, so there's not much more to be said, but he certainly seems to be similarly morally unscrupulous to Caribou, making it an even stronger possibility that the two are related. We then jump forward 1 year to the start of the God Valley incident in the West Blue, 38 years before the present, where Shanks and Shamrock's mother introduces them to their father Garling for the first time, before being brutally slain. With callous indifference, Garling refuses her invitation for him to live together with his would-be family, then brutally stabs her and leaves her for dead. We here learn that Garling orchestrated not only the location of the manhunt, but also Shakky's kidnapping, as he intends to win the Celestial Dragon's barbaric contest, and as a reward, take Shakky as his wife. This would seem to offer further evidence that Garling didn't recognize some special quality in Shanks and Shamrock's mother, which prompted him to choose her to have his children. But it's certainly not conclusive proof, especially when Oda still maintained secrecy regarding her name and face. With the arrival of a massive marine and world government fleet, we're introduced to yet another key figure of the God Valley incident, a young Monkey D. Dragon as a 17-year-old cadet, the same year Luffy was when he first set sail. Notably, Dragon already has his distinctive armband, bearing what appears to be some sort of tribal markings. These markings are similar to those of the Shandorans, which makes me curious about their origin and significance to Dragon. Dragon clearly has a strong sense of justice, even at a young age, as he seems more willing to question orders than his fellow cadets, as although he and his platoon aren't fully aware of what's about to transpire, Dragon at least seems to sense something isn't quite right. Nevertheless, I get the impression that his complicity in carrying out these orders will weigh heavily on Dragon as he moves forward in life, and fuels his righteous anger toward the world nobles. We next cut to the prison ship transporting the Celestial Dragon's captives en route to God Valley. We here see Ginny sneak into the communications room and leak the intel about the prizes the Celestial Dragons have put on offer, which we previously learned in Chapter 1096 served as the catalyst for Rox and Roger to arrive on the shores of God Valley in time to interfere with the planned manhunt. Worth noting, in Chapter 1096, Ginny, expert in thieving and wiretapping, said she sent the transmission about the prizes being offered and the location of the manhunt to the outside world 2 weeks before the actual start of the God Valley incident. That means that Rox and Roger were given about a 2-week window to make the journey in time. We also learned through this chapter that the intel Ginny leaked didn't reach Pirate Island directly, but rather was intercepted by a young Big News Morgans, already hiding his true face using his own fruit. Morgans extorts Cypherpole by threatening to release the intel if they don't pay up, but plans to release the news to Pirate Island regardless, not because he has any moral qualms about what's about to transpire on God Valley, but likely because he'll be able to sell more papers with the sensational headlines he can write in its aftermath should Rox become involved. It's interesting then that God Valley could be so thoroughly covered up with someone like Morgans already following the news closely. On that note, Cypherpole seems perplexed by the extent of Morgan's intel network, which really does seem unusual, considering the fact that Morgan's is only 15 years old at this point in the timeline, and his World Economic Journal seemingly only circulates to a small number of readers, given that the Cypherpole agent derisively refers to it as a school paper. Interestingly, the design of the all-black marine prison transfer ship carrying the Celestial Dragon's captives to God Valley seems to match the hull design of Dragon's current ship, the Wind Granma, which could indicate that, fittingly, the flagship of the Revolutionary Army was commandeered from the world government and repurposed to instead liberate those held captive. In the next scene, we see the news of Shakky's whereabouts spread by Morgans to both Pirate Island as well as the Roger Pirates. Oddly enough, the rat Wang Ji seems to sweat upon hearing the news and tries to downplay its veracity, questioning the source of the intel. This is most likely because he was paid off by the government's agents to abduct Shakky and accordingly doesn't want to see her rescued. Miss Buchan verifies the intel seemingly by wiretapping marine transmissions, while Gloriosa, Gonzui, John, and Shiki are all fired up to go rescue Shakky. Here Whitebeard states that he believed the Celestial Dragon's manhunt was just a tall tale, verifying that while rumors of this ritual spread across the seas, most people don't believe them to be true. Linlin and Kaido discuss the devil fruit being offered, and we here see that their designs have been slightly adjusted, likely to reconcile the fact that they both seem to be illustrated at the wrong ages in chapter 1096. Interestingly, however, this chapter introduces yet another timeline discontinuity with Kaido's mini flashback from chapter 1049. In chapter 1159, we see the Rocks pirates learn the intel about God Valley while present on Pirate Island, with Kaido and Big Mom sitting together with the rest of the crew. Conversely, in 1059, they appeared to be out at sea. I guess the scene in 1049 could be interpreted as taking place on the interior of Fuloled, even though it appears to be inside the cabin of a ship. We next see the Roger Pirates aboard the Uro Jackson learn about the news and set course for God Valley as well. As the narration box reads, the tiniest bit of intel set off all the fiercest warriors on the sea. On that note, I was surprised to learn that none of the key figures involved on God Valley were there for the same reason. Roger was there to rescue Shakky, while Garp was there to fight Roger. Despite the story of God Valley recounted by Sengoku in chapter 957, neither Garp nor Roger arrived on God Valley for the primary purpose of confronting Xebec, or foiling his plot to become World King, which, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, begs the question of what exactly transpires during the incident to prompt their fateful battle. In the next scene, we see Harald aboard his giant flagship arrive to confront Xebec en route to God Valley. Harald reveals that Elbaph is now working with government monitors and was waiting for Rocks to make his move to rescue Shakky. Xebec in response calls Harald King of the Giant Oafs, and then again makes a salient point that the world government sits on its lofty perch and watches as the people and nations of the world are pitted against one another to tear each other apart. Of course, Xebec's words here have to be understood in the context that he wants the world united under his own flag, but that doesn't change the fact that his assessment is ultimately correct. The government's evil ruler is indeed afraid of the forces of liberation working together, including in the present Shirahoshi, Luffy, and even Blackbeard. Again, this reinforces my belief that ultimately, perhaps after a climactic battle of their own, Luffy and Blackbeard are meant to reconcile whatever conflict began with Joy Boy and Davy Jones, such that the pirating world, unified under Pirate King Luffy, can at last fulfill the intended purpose of the Jolly Roger, with Luffy and Teach working together to triumph over Lord Imu. Yet rather than immediately engage in another battle, Xebec instead invites Harald to talk in private, where he chooses to confide with him that his true name is not Rocks, but rather Davy D. Xebec, member of the Davy clan. He asserts that the world government tried to cover up the name of the Davy clan, descendants of the infamous pirate Davy D. Jones. Thus, Xebec is not only a worshipper of Davy Jones and inheritor of his will, but also his direct biological descendant. Again, we still don't know exactly how Xebec has learned so much about the world's past and the true nature of the world government's leadership, but it's likely tied to his Davy clan lineage. I previously proposed numerous potential explanations, including soul transfer, direct preservation of Davy Jones' memories, or even oral tradition, if unlike the rest of the world, Davy Jones and his descendants never forgot the events of the Void Century in the first place. I'm also curious where Xebec came up with the name Rocks, and if it has any personal significance. It's possible it belonged to a parent if only either his father or mother belonged to the Davy clan, but could also have been adopted in reverence for a yet unknown mentor figure. It's curious then that the world government has specifically sought to erase or cover up the Davy clan. It begs the question what makes them unique among others who bear the will of D. Imu told Cobra that the D are their enemies, though also says that they don't even know the meaning of their own name. This seemingly verifies that Imu and the Elders are well aware of the D's true meaning, which makes me wonder why they haven't taken greater effort to erase the various D clans. Instead, Ace and Teach were extended invitations to join the Warlords, while Garp, Dragon, and Saul were all allowed to openly serve in the Marines without hiding their D name. Essentially, since we know that Imu knows the D is a symbol taken by his primordial enemies, I wonder why the Davy clan specifically is hated and hunted, while the D name itself doesn't need to be kept hidden. I guess the explanation is that since the D themselves don't know what their name signifies, Imu doesn't feel the need to hunt them down. But this is also the same Imu and world government that sought to track down and kill Roger's unborn child based solely on his bloodline. You'd think that the D would all be similarly reviled given that Imu knows them to be descendants from his ancient enemies. As I've said in the past, I believe the D are descended from Joy Boy's crewmates, taken as a secret symbol of their fellowship, much like the X used to mark the arms of the Straw Hats on Alabasta. On that note, it's perhaps significant that the X mark used on Alabasta was actually a secondary signal to prevent it from being copied by an imposter. The crew's armbands covered up the X, such that an imposter might copy the bandage without knowing about the X hidden underneath. Perhaps this could tell us that so too did those who carry the will of D use a secondary symbol, especially since they don't even know the meaning of their own name in the present. It also opens up the possibility that an imposter could have taken the name D without knowing it somehow obscures a secondary hidden meaning. For example, the Davy clan could be fake Ds, though honestly I do not believe that to be the case. I also thought that Imu might have suspected that the D were descended from his enemies, but only received full confirmation when Cobra read Lily's letter aloud. But returning to the Reverie chapters, it's clear he already had full knowledge of the D's identity. If it had taken Imu a long time to find out what the D symbolizes, it would have been easier to explain why they aren't actively hunted down like the Davy clan, Buccaneers, and Lunarians. But as things stand, all we're left with are more questions by this reveal. As I've discussed previously, I think it's at least plausible that Joy Boy had a traitor among his own crewmates, much as Judas Iscariot was one of Jesus' 12 apostles prior to his betrayal. And in that sense, even if Davy Jones was Joy Boy's primordial Morganeer adversary, this wouldn't conflict with him also carrying the name D as a former crewmate. Another possibility is that Davy D. Jones was the true name of Joy Boy himself, thus explaining why the Davy clan are so reviled among the D. Personally, I think this is unlikely, as I find it hard to believe that Oda would casually reveal Joy Boy's name before we learn the true history of the Void Century. It also would seem strange for Blackbeard and Xebec to be the ones who worship Davy Jones if their understanding of his ideals was so distorted, despite Xebec having so much more knowledge about the world government secrets than any of the other bearers of the Will of D, at least until Roger discovered Laughdale. Further complicating this question, we know that Trafalgar Law also keeps both the D and the middle name Wooder hidden, with his full name being Trafalgar D. Wooderlaw. However, unlike Xebec, who hides his family name, but publicly displays the D in the name Rox D. Xebec, Law hides the D in his name as well as a second middle name, Wooder. It's thus unclear if the motivations for these decisions to hide parts of their names are the same. I had initially thought that perhaps each D clan had a true family name kept hidden, and an assumed family name taken at the end of the Void Century. But given that Law's family name is still Trafalgar, not Wooder, I don't think that line of thought makes a whole lot of sense. Ultimately, I think the Davy clan's persecution probably comes down to something which transpired between Davy Jones himself and Imu all the way back in the Void Century. As noted earlier, the Davy backfight was invented on Pirate Island many years ago, perhaps dating back to a time not long after the Void Century. Maybe Davy Jones or his clan were the first prisoners exiled to Foled, where they invented the Davy backfight. Returning to the messianic symbolism we discussed earlier, it's also worth noting that though Judas did indeed betray Jesus, he later came to regret that choice, and according to the Gospel of Matthew, tried returning the 30 pieces of silver he received as payment. If my speculation is correct, that Davy Jones was Joy Boy's traitor, perhaps he too had a change of heart when he realized he struck a deal with the devil. Although Joy Boy was ultimately met with defeat, we can also surmise that Imu's victory was incomplete, that he doesn't yet have all that he wants. In which case, perhaps Davy Jones, Xebec's ancestor, not only set Joy Boy up for failure, but also, at the 11th hour, prevented Imu from achieving a complete victory. in which case this could explain why the Davy clan is so hated. Xebec also tells Harald that the Davy clan took root in the underworld, which makes me wonder if in the present, the underworld emperors and yet unnamed observers from Punk Hazard could re-enter the story to play an important role when Davy D Teach takes the stage as primary antagonist and clashes with Luffy for the title of Pirate King. Xebec then reveals to Harald that God Valley was his home. He recently married and had a son, and sent them back to his homeland to seek shelter with the Davy clan. Accordingly, Xebec asserts that it was an act of fate which gave him forewarning that his wife, child, and family are now in danger of the Celestial Dragon's manhunt. Had Shakky not been abducted, and had the transmission not been leaked, he would have had no way of knowing what was about to transpire on God Valley. However, inexplicably, Xebec then tells Harald that he feels fortune is no longer on his side, and accordingly asks him to lend his strength to help rescue his wife and young Teach. Here Xebec seems to be nothing more than a husband and father who aims to protect his family and his homeland, which is a far warmer sentiment than I would have expected given all that we've learned about the God Valley incident. It makes perfect sense that the world government would distort the truth, but given that Xebec was also opposed by Roger and Garp, characters whom we know to have much stronger moral compass than the Celestial Dragons, suggested that Xebec's plans were more sinister than rescuing his innocent family from the fiendish Holy Knights conducting a mass slaughter of 100,000 innocent civilians. This is especially true when Xebec himself verifies the part of the story that he wants to become World King. It's important to note that Teach was not born on God Valley, but rather an island called Shadeport in the New World according to the Viva cards. Despite that fact, it's notable that he and Shanks essentially share the same hometown in God Valley, as the two are very clearly linked by fate. In fact, there is no instance of one appearing on a volume cover absent the other, so Oda has continually emphasized this connection throughout the series. Harald refuses Xebec's plea for help, and instead makes another attempt on his life, which again leads me back to the conclusion that while Harald's vision for Elbaph's future may be positive, earning him his reputation as Elbaph's most beloved king, he's made far too many moral compromises to achieve his desired end by entangling himself with the world government. Despite the fact that he refuses to accompany Rox to God Valley, I do still wonder if he'll show up, even to help some of the people from this non-affiliated country escape to safety, given that Loki and Harald are still ostensibly the focus of this flashback. It seems Oda is committed to showing the God Valley flashback in full, so for that to be told within the context of Harald's flashback, I have to wonder if Harald will somehow be part of this pivotal event. With that said, I do have a hard time imagining what role he could possibly play in an incident which already involves so many key figures from the pirating world. The narration box states that every 3 years, the Celestial Dragons choose an unaffiliated nation rich in natural resources to conduct their evil manhunt, slaughtering the innocent inhabitants for sport. On God Valley, there are over 100,000 residents, with 13 marked as super rare rabbits, including the Buccaneer Bartholomew Kuma. This suggests that there are 12 known members of the Davy clan currently living at the time of the God Valley incident. At this particular manhunt, the Celestial Dragons are offering Shakky as the top prize, in addition to 9 devil fruit, including Kuma's paw fruit and Kaido's mythical fish fruit. This means that there are 7 additional devil fruit yet to be identified, though Big Mom earlier stated that some might be suitable for her children. This means that some of the Charlotte children's devil fruit could be among those yet to be identified prizes. In the last scene of chapter 1159, we see Dragon discover Shanks and Shamrock's mortally wounded mother cradling her 2 babies as she pleads with him to keep them safe. Importantly, she begs Dragon not to let Garling have them, which indicates that although Garling didn't immediately take custody of Shanks and Shamrock, he still intended to raise them as Celestial Dragons. At the same time, we see a young Teach being comforted by his mother. Again, there are strong parallels here between Shanks and Teach, both being shielded by their mothers as the Celestial Dragon manhunt begins. The announcer states that the Davy clan have been missing for 800 years, which further confirms that whatever enmity Imu has toward this particular D lineage was indeed born from some perceived crime committed toward the close of the Void Century. On the opening page of chapter 1160, we see the Celestial Dragons viciously mocking and dehumanizing the Davy clan in preparation for their hunt. We see Teach's mother's face as she tries to shield her innocent son from the nobles. It's worth noting that her design doesn't at all resemble the sketch Oda revealed for an early concept of Blackbeard's mother. This isn't particularly surprising, as I didn't think he'd so casually reveal someone integral to Blackbeard's backstory in a data book. But this also seems like a pretty strong indication that Blackbeard's two sisters, revealed in those sketches, have also been scrapped. Alternatively, those characters could later appear as an adopted family, depending on how Teach escapes from God Valley. Seeing a young Teach traumatized by the unfiltered hatred being directed at him and his family seems like even stronger confirmation to me that Blackbeard is not the final villain of the series. Hatred and oppression has been continuously shown to be a vicious and bloody cycle in the One Piece world, and Teach was not the cause. He wasn't the one who set this whole conflict in motion, but rather, his malice was born from the trauma of having endured such violence at such a young and impressionable age. Blackbeard is Luffy's moral foil, but his thematic complement. He does bad things and he's willing to hurt others to achieve his goals, but he's driven by the same immutable forces of dreams, inherited will, and the guiding hand of fate, which Roger asserted are meant to guide the world towards freedom. The world government, and by extension Imu, are not only Luffy's moral foil, but also his thematic antithesis. They represent oppression and the desire to stamp down liberty and justice. Simply put, they don't do bad things for reasons that could be perceived as almost noble, like Luffy's rival pirate emperors, but rather do bad things for bad reasons, to make themselves gods. Luffy's greatest strength isn't the ability to beat up those who stand in his way, but rather to make friends and allies wherever he goes. Luffy versus Teach may be the deciding factor in which brand of pirate rises up to challenge the world, but Luffy doesn't just defeat his enemies, he makes them allies. Ultimately, as suggested by the fact that Luffy, Shirahoshi, and Blackbeard's images were all defaced in the same manner in the Chamber of Flowers, I believe Teach will become a necessary ally in the battle against Imu, not as a precursor to his own duplicitous heel-turn power grab, culminating in a showdown against he and his Titanic captains amidst the wreckage of the world government, but as a symbolic healing of the ancient schism which first emerged 8 centuries earlier between Joy Boy and Blackbeard's primordial Morganeer predecessor, potentially named Davy Jones. This schism ultimately doomed Joy Boy's alliance, and prevented the Jolly Roger from serving the purpose intended from its very creation. Joy Boy was the first pirate, so the very term pirate emerged from Joy Boy's quest for freedom. Luffy's ascension to Pirate King represents a consolidation of the entire pirating world under a new monarch. I'm not saying that all pirates will now magically swear fealty to Luffy, that's not even something Luffy wants. But when Luffy becomes Pirate King, the war amongst the emperors will have at last been decided, and in that sense, I think as a failed contender, even Blackbeard will ultimately submit, potentially arriving at the 11th hour to help achieve the world's ultimate liberation from the darkness which has reigned for centuries, if not millennia. In simple terms, it comes down to the question, who is the most satisfying person for Luffy to punch in the endgame of the series? The kid who was once a victim of a human hunt, or the immortal demonic perpetrator of said human hunt? With all that said, we now see the deep traumatic experiences which fuel Blackbeard's ambition, and gives us a much better understanding of Blackbeard's character. We next see Shanks and Shamrock's mother using her dying breath to ask Dragon to keep her sons away from Garling. She further asks him to find someone kind-hearted to raise them. We previously saw a sketch of the Roger Pirates, following the events of God Valley, discovering infant Shanks inside a treasure chest matching the design of those in which the Devil Fruit prizes are being kept. While this seems to confirm that Dragon manages to smuggle Shanks to safety by hiding him in one of the treasure chests, the fact that his mother directly asks Dragon to find someone kind-hearted to raise him indicates that Dragon purposely left Shanks in Roger's care, and also, by extension, we can infer that Dragon witnesses something on God Valley which convinces him of Roger's upstanding moral character. It's also poetic knowing that Dragon saved the life of young Kuma decades before the two would formally meet and unite to form the Revolutionary Army. Garling tells Saturn that discovery of the Davy clan was simply an act of fate, which emphasizes the fact that the Celestial Dragons believe they're destined to hold their positions of rulership. This wording is also highly reminiscent of the Elder's words about Sabo when they believed he had been on Lelouch as the island was selected for destruction. There's more to be said about what that means for the Elder's motivations, but they seem to have simply resigned themselves to their fate in full knowledge that they've made a Faustian pact with the devil, which they're either unwilling or unable to break. Imu has them now, and as far as they're aware, there's no turning back. This is simply their fate. As the hunt begins, we see a number of vignettes displaying the true depravity and cruelty of the world nobles. At this point, we've seen numerous such scenes throughout the series in isolation, but it's still brutal to see their concentrated malice unleashed on the innocent people of God Valley. Gunko is designated not as a holy knight, but rather the devoted blade of God. We know she was already serving directly by Imu's side 18 years prior when Xebec invaded the Holy Land, so this designation could be the reason Imu was able to take direct possession of her on Elbaph. We next see the Rock's pirates arrive, mirroring the scene from chapter 1096. Xebec hasn't told anyone but Harald that his true motivation is to rescue his wife and son, nor has he mentioned the fact that he doesn't particularly expect to survive this battle. So he instead leads the charge into battle by cautioning his crew against infighting, since they'll simply split up the loot afterward. The men on the crew all seem motivated to rescue Shakky in effort to win her affection, though each in manner fitting their unique personalities. The treasure-obsessed Captain John thinks Jules will win her heart, while good-natured Whitebeard is primarily motivated to save a friend, even if he wouldn't say no to her falling in love with him as a result. Big Mom and Kaido, on the other hand, are more primarily interested in claiming Devil Fruit. Notably, Kaido is the only man on rocks who hasn't been shown to be enamored with Shakky, which makes me wonder if he already has a betrothed. God Valley took place about 10 years before the birth of Yamato, but we still don't know anything about the ogres or their island of origin. We know that Yamato was born in the Grand Line, but not on Wano, and her title of Ogre Princess could indicate that either Kaido or her yet unnamed mother is the leader of the ogres. In subsequent pages, Roger and Garp arrive, while the Holy Knights of God assemble, bringing together all the key players for the battle which is about to unfold. In chapter 1161, we see the chaotic battle on God Valley unfold as Roger, Rox, and a multitude of other pirates converge toward the island center, each desperately trying to be the first to rescue Shakky. On the opening page, we learn through Xebec's thought bubble that his wife's name is Eris, though it'll be interesting to see if her family name is Marshall, and if, like Rouge, she's also a bearer of the Will of D. In fact, this page presents panels of Roger, Xebec, and Garp, the three key figures of this battle destined to converge, as each pursuing three independent goals. Roger is looking for Shakky, Garp is looking for Roger, while Xebec is looking for Teach and Eris. We next see Dragon, desperately trying to carry Shanks and Shamrock to safety, cornered by one of the Holy Knights, Saint Maffy of the Satchel's family, revealing yet another of the first 20 clans, along with Bavette, bringing the total up to 13. As expected, Dragon already feels immense guilt for having helped set up this twisted celestial game, and views rescuing the twins as a means of atonement. Tragically, Maffy manages to recover Shamrock, though before she can strike down Dragon, Whitebeard and Big Mom arrive on the scene, allowing Dragon to escape with Shanks. The double-page panel of Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, and Shakky assembling to fight back-to-back was a nice inclusion, and reinforces the idea that had he not challenged Garp and Sengoku following Roger's execution, Shakky could have been the fourth emperor reigning over the New World. In fact, I'd even assert that prior to Roger's execution, these four may rise to the top of the New World, especially since we know that Shakky had already assembled a massive fleet by the time of the Edwar Sea battle. On that note, I wonder if the fall of rocks could even have taken a small bit of inspiration from the demise of Alexander the Great, with both Xebec and Alexander's kingdoms divided up among their four greatest generals. Garp again proves to be immensely powerful and likely on par with, if not superior to any of the four emperors in combat, as he faces the Rock's pirates head-on. Dragon seems surprised to see his father, so I'm hoping we'll see more of their interaction before the dust settles. It seems likely Dragon will be direct witness to the battle between Roger, Garp, and Xebec, given that he ultimately leaves Shanks in Roger's care. The Rocks and Roger pirates then begin converging on the center of the island, approaching from opposite sides of the valley. Notably, from this scene it appears that Captain John wielded Eustace Kidd's magnetic powers, connecting yet another member of the most prominent pirates currently sailing the seas to the incident on God Valley, albeit indirectly through John, now Kidd's Devil Fruit. In retrospect, it's a bit strange that neither Kaido nor Big Mom seem to recognize John's power while fighting Kidd on Wano, but even if they did, neither seems to look back on the Rocks era fondly, so it's doubtful either would have expressed any positive sentiment in seeing John's Devil Fruit power being wielded against them. Thus far on God Valley, Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, and Shakky have seen quite a bit of action, and while I'm happy to see more of these characters with whom we're already familiar, I'm also really hoping that the other members of Rocks like John, Gansui, Barbell, Kyo, Gil, and Gloriosa are given the opportunity to shine as well, even if it's just in a few pages showing the Rocks pirates clashing with the Holy Knights in the coming chapters. As much as it's nice to see Whitebeard again, the other lesser-known members of the Rocks pirates haven't yet really been seen in action, so this is a good opportunity for us to learn more about them. Oda can do a lot with a small number of pages. For example, just look at how much we learn about the powers and fighting style of the worst generation captains in a short number of chapters on Sabaody. In the final scene of chapter 1161, Summers attempts to murder a chained up Shakky, only for Rayleigh to come to her rescue at the last moment. Shakky's attack as she tries to fight back is highly reminiscent of Hancock's, which leads me to suspect Shakky is the one who trained Hancock in combat after she was liberated from Arishwa. Summers, like Garling, has continuously proven to be one of the most vile and depraved characters in the series, so it was cathartic to see Rayleigh send him flying, even if we know his immortality prevents him from incurring any real lasting damage. Interestingly, Rayleigh's attack refers to the red spider lily, which Oda listed as Blackbeard's characteristic flower in SBS. Further, decades later we've seen Shakky wear a shirt with a red spider pattern. The warmly sentiment romantic scene between Rayleigh and Shakky was a nice close to the chapter, but leaves us with an abundance of questions about how the rest of the God Valley incident is going to progress, given that the Roger Pirates have successfully completed their main quest, so to speak. And as far as we're aware, Xebec's goal has absolutely nothing to do with Shakky. So now that all the pieces are in place and the action on God Valley is beginning, there are a number of key questions remaining. First and foremost, what ultimately happened to God Valley itself? Certainly, under normal circumstances, the world government takes measures to erase any island where they commit atrocities like the human hunt and the burning of Ohara from the world's maps. But this seems like something more, as Sengoku stated that the island itself has disappeared entirely. It's worth noting that at this point in time, the world government didn't yet have access to Dr. Vegapunk's mother flame, so it's highly unlikely that God Valley suffered the same fate as Lelouch. This is especially true given all the key figures assembled on the island, none of whom have witnessed anything on the magnitude of Lelouch's destruction. This makes me wonder if the island is going to be moved or transported somewhere else, perhaps using a devil fruit power of some kind. Like, say young Kuma awakens his devil fruit unintentionally and uses the paw fruit to teleport the entire island before teleporting himself to safety. Of course, we have no indication that that happened, but it at least seems plausible. If so, that begs the question where it's located now, and if all the people on God Valley, like Xebec, are actually dead. In the past, I even speculated, given the significance of God Valley to almost all of the key figures in the One Piece world, including Shanks, Blackbeard, and Luffy, that it might make for a good hiding place for the last road poneglyph. Though, of course, that was before we learned about Burnscar and his black ship. That said, God Valley could still make for a good location for Luffy and Blackbeard's eventual showdown. If God Valley, a West Blue island, was transported into the Grand Line, it likely wouldn't be found via logboats, without a distinct magnetic signature, and thus would effectively serve as a hidden island. To be clear, I'm not saying that the currently missing road poneglyph was on God Valley 38 years ago. We know that it was on Fishman Island at that point in time, but it has since disappeared. Alternatively, there have been many theories that God Valley, or at least part of the island, was used to form Thriller Bark, since Moria had access to the corpses of at least 2 former Rocks Pirates members, and Thriller Bark, like God Valley, originated in the West Blue. With that said, it seems unlikely that John actually died on God Valley, since he's one of the pirates said to have earned his own infamous reputation after the God Valley incident and the fall of Rocks. On that basis, we know that at least one of the former Rocks Pirates members was unearthed at some point after God Valley. So ultimately, I think this points away from God Valley being Thriller Bark in the present, and thus makes it a fairly weak theory. Given that we don't know the full extent of Imu's powers, and that Gunko, Imu's Blue Sea avatar, is on God Valley during the incident, it's also possible that he could use his magic to either flip the island into the abyss, or make it disappear using some power we haven't yet seen. A final, completely baseless idea, I can't even call a theory, is that God Valley was miniaturized, and is now carried like a ship in a bottle, perhaps aboard Burnscar's black ship. I'm even wondering if this flashback could give us some hint toward Burnscar's identity, perhaps even a participant of the battle on God Valley, which gave him the Burnscar for which he's now named. Again, I'm not saying this with any degree of certainty, but it's certainly interesting that nearly all of the important figures in One Piece world history were involved or related to someone involved in the God Valley incident, and perhaps this mysterious figure Burnscar is no different. Prior to the start of Harald's flashback, Roxy Xebec was described and pictured as a ruthless, cold-hearted monster who pillaged, plundered, and otherwise pilfered his weaselly black guts out, all in a bid to coronate himself world king. Yet, surprisingly, Very little of this flashback has shown the actual terror Xebec sowed during the 6-year reign of the Rock's pirates. While Xebec hasn't been viewed entirely in a sympathetic light, Rox also hasn't been portrayed as the cutthroat monster Sengoku described in Chapter 957. Rox indeed targets the world government, and while his tactics may be considered ruthless, the government itself is a tyrannical entity responsible for a litany of barbaric crimes. Xebec's direct challenge to Imu and Marijois also reframes many of his aggressive actions as a deliberate act of rebellion against this demonic entity responsible for many of the world's evils. While certainly a former Marine Fleet Admiral would have a biased view of one of history's most infamous pirates, the key reason we as readers were led to believe that Rox lived up to his description ties to the fact that he was directly opposed by former Pirate King Goldie Roger, whom we know to share Luffy's dream and ideals. This alone suggested that Xebec was a pirate morally aligned with the likes of Kaido, Big Mom, and most notably Blackbeard. These characters are often tragic figures with motivations deeply rooted in past trauma, whose actions are nevertheless villainous. And again, throughout this flashback we've heard about the darker elements of Xebec's character, but they've rarely been shown to us directly. Instead, Xebec's actual panel time has been largely spent on his long conversations with Harald, during which he's repeatedly made valid points about the world government's tyrannical nature. Accordingly, even Xebec's declaration that he intends to crown himself world king doesn't come across as sinister as it would otherwise. To illustrate this fact, let's look at Kaido and Big Mom. Kaido has declared his ambition to plunge the world into perpetual war, such that the weak nobles can no longer oppress those who are innately powerful. Kaido's belief that reorienting the world's hierarchy on the basis of physical strength rather than wealth or political power will make it more fair is rooted in his traumatic upbringing, and thus, while this isn't portrayed as a noble or morally justifiable goal, we nevertheless understand that his faulty conclusion is predicated on recognition of a real injustice. Big Mom's desire to turn Totland into a place where all people and races can live in harmony is also rooted in the prejudice she's witnessed and experienced from the time she was a child, which once again doesn't justify her villainous actions, but does root them in deep traumatic emotions, and reframes them as a tragically misguided attempt to correct a very real injustice. Importantly, however, we readers also directly witness Kaido and Big Mom's villainous actions in the present, so while we later gain deeper insight into their tragic backstories and underlying motivations, we nevertheless still understood them to be antagonistic villainous forces. By contrast with Xebec, on panel we've only really seen his human side, without directly witnessing his villainous actions, which in my view erroneously leads many readers to the conclusion that Xebec was wholly misunderstood and misrepresented by Sengoku. Again, while I don't doubt that someone like Sengoku would hold a biased view of pirates in general, even more so a figure like Roxy Xebec, I think it would be similarly incorrect to reinterpret the man said to be Roger's first and greatest rival as simply misunderstood. All that is to say, Xebec still represents a brand of piracy which is morally antithetical to those like Luffy, Roger, and Joy Boy, warriors of liberation and champions of freedom. Xebec may correctly diagnose many of the world's wrongs under the world government's rulership, but importantly, the cure he offers is also poison. Notably, because Xebec's story is something of an interlude in the middle of a larger flashback centered on Harald and Loki, we've really only learned the immediately relevant details about Rox. Most significantly, we don't know the backstory of Davy Jones, the means by which Xebec has come to possess such arcane knowledge of the One Piece world, and what initially motivated his desire to become World King. We know what Xebec wants, but not why he wants it. Xebec's views and ambitions have been primarily used within the context of this flashback to serve as a foil to Harald, to challenge his ambition of allying Elbaph to the world government, and to warn him of the dark fate we readers know awaits the King of the Giants. But we also know Xebec was a man with his own ambition for global conquest, based on his own words, and though we haven't seen his barbaric acts portrayed on panel, we have reliably been told that he's willing to cross moral and ethical boundaries to achieve his ultimate goal. Further, we can surmise that much like Marshall D. Teach, Xebec is the type who is always working deliberately toward achieving a master plan, with fate intervening at critical junctures. I say all this because everything in Harald's flashback thus far leads us to take Xebec's words at face value, that he's a man merely seeking to protect his innocent wife and child from the evil celestial dragon's bloody manhunt. We even see that his thoughts dwell on Eris and Teach as he races through the battlefield on God Valley. At this point, I'd even say that it's most likely true that Xebec is most interested in saving his family. But I simply want to ask the question, what if Xebec isn't being fully honest? Certainly, Xebec and Blackbeard are the type to lie and cheat to get what they want. And by all accounts, whether or not my speculation is correct, Davy D. Jones in the One Piece world was not a good or noble pirate, but rather a cutthroat, bloodthirsty villain who made a pact with a demon and was cursed as a result. Accordingly, what if all that's happening on God Valley in truth serves Xebec's ultimate goal of becoming world king? By no means a noble ambition. What if everything that's transpired has done so according to his own design? Xebec told Harald that fortune isn't on his side, and regardless of whether or not any of this speculation is correct, I do believe his concern for his family is genuine. But I also wonder, what if Xebec used his clan as bait? Xebec rejected King Harald's suggestion that the world government chose God Valley to entrap him, and said that kidnapping Shakky was the world government's biggest blunder. But what if, instead, this was Xebec's trap for the world government? In 1096, Gloriosa said that God Valley would be the final battle, which, given the context, probably alludes to what she perceived to be the battle for Roger's heart. But I wonder if this could instead signal that she believes the God Valley incident in some way serves Xebec's grand plan. Remember, Xebec told his crew that he was seeking 2 devil fruit, and that they would have the choice whether or not to follow him on a certain fateful day when he put his plan into motion. This also brings us back to many of the key questions about Xebec and the Davy clan. How does Xebec even know about Imu, and what secrets could this reveal about the Davy clan as a whole, including Xebec? I've offered a number of potential theories throughout this analysis, but I'll again remind you that in the One Piece world, villains who presume themselves gods reveal themselves to be true devils by turning their acts of violence into depraved games played using their victims. They take sport in harming others, which is, in essence, the ultimate way of displaying the loss of their humanity. Examples include Eneru on Skypiea, Doflamingo on Dressrosa, the Knights on Elbaph, and perhaps most prominently, Imu's power to flip pieces on the game board to serve his dark ends. The Davy backfight, presumably invented by the Davy clan in honor of their ancestor, is the only known pirate tradition which borrows from the Celestial Dragon's playbook, and Robin correctly described the game as cruel. Nearly Xebec's entire crew was assembled by playing this game, and he carried a pistol with him when he challenged Imu, perhaps signaling that Xebec has been playing the devil's game. Now, in that context, remember Iva's words that the only way to win is to escape the game entirely, because the rules are rigged in the devil's favor. Rox may believe he's playing Imu, but by even engaging in the devil's game, he's ultimately playing himself, and this could be what leads to his ultimate demise. Importantly, the biggest question remains, what could possibly prompt the kind-hearted Roger and the morally just Garp to stand between Xebec and the Celestial Dragons, especially knowing we're not dealing with only run-of-the-mill, ignorant, and petulant nobles like Charlos, but rather the Holy Knights of God and Saint Saturn himself, all willingly and violently complicit in the world government's most heinous crimes, and also more than capable of fighting for themselves. Moreover, Roger's crew have effectively already completed their mission by rescuing Shakky, and Garp is no fan of the world nobles. Further, if we assume Xebec's words to Harald were true, he's a man whose sole intent is to rescue his wife Eris and son Teach, so it's even more dubious that Roger and Garp would band together to break apart Rox as Sengoku described in chapter 957. Okay, so then maybe the answer is as simple as Sengoku exaggerating Roger's role on God Valley. Maybe he, Garp, and Xebec ended up fighting in a 3-way battle, but Roger wasn't intent on directly sabotaging Xebec. However, personally, I don't think that answer makes much sense. Remember, the world government has intentionally covered up Roger's involvement on God Valley, and the Marines to whom Sengoku was speaking had absolutely no knowledge of the Rock's pirates, much less Xebec and the infamous incident which occurred 38 years prior. Accordingly, Sengoku would have no reason to lie about Roger's role in breaking apart Rox, because he had no reason to bring up Roger's involvement unprompted in the first place. This tells us that the part of the story about Roger and Garp fighting together against Xebec is not a fabrication created by a biased narrator, but can be counted as fact, and as such, our speculation has to assume that Roger makes a deliberate and intentional stand against Rox as the God Valley incident reaches its climax. But again, I ask, for what reason would Roger and Garp turn to face Xebec directly when none of them seem to have competing goals? The first, and most obvious answer, is that Imu uses his reversey powers to flip Xebec to the dark side. After all, we know Gunko was on the island, and we've seen what an Imu-possessed Gunko was able to do to Dorian Bragi with relative ease. Maybe Xebec becomes possessed by Imu, fitting the more monstrous imagery we saw in Xebec's previous silhouettes. With that said, we don't yet know what, if any, limitations might prevent Imu from taking possession of a particular target, though there does appear to be some need for a blood pact of some sort based on what we've seen on Elbaph. It's hard to speculate whether or not Xebec could be possessed by Imu when we don't yet know exactly how this reversey power works. But with that said, I'm not sure it would make much sense for Imu to use a possessed Xebec to attack his own subjects. Remember, we were told that Roger and Garp fought Xebec to protect the Celestial Dragons. I'm also not sure Imu would feel inclined to possess Xebec when he already had a slew of his own elite warriors on the battlefield of God Valley in the form of the Holy Knights and even one of the Five Elders. Rather, it would seem Xebec is the one he most wants to see killed. And if we assume the opposite, that Imu took control of Xebec because he wanted to kill Roger, it wouldn't make sense then for Garp to stand by Roger's side, against the world government. Further, I'm not sure how Xebec's possession would prompt Roger to stick around when their primary goal should now be to ferry Shakky to safety before she can be reclaimed by Garling and the Knights. Alternatively, it's possible Imu takes possession of Roger and Garp, turning them against Xebec, as the former captain of Rocks desperately tries to rescue his family. I'm also not sure this makes a whole lot of sense either. While Garp isn't a blind loyalist and doesn't care for the Celestial Dragons, he still recognizes protecting the world nobles as part of his job, and clearly doesn't need to be possessed to fight against the Rock's pirates. On the other hand, if only Roger was possessed, it would completely undermine the narrative significance of Roger's moral opposition to Xebec, and diminish the importance of his once having fought side by side with Garp. Mostly, I think it would completely undercut the notion of Xebec being Roger's greatest rival if their final battle was in any way puppeteered by Imu, and would smooth over any ideological divide between the two about the true meaning of the Jolly Roger. Remember, Luffy and Blackbeard have inherited the wills of Roger and Xebec respectively, so there's every reason to assume Roger and Rocks were just as diametrically opposed and represented two completely different brands of piracy. Yet if there was no real character motivation for their final battle, and it was instead simply driven by possession, many of these differences would be completely flattened out. I think it would be narratively and thematically anticlimactic. As noted, because this is fundamentally Harald's flashback, we've only seen the parts of Xebec's story that were pertinent to Elbaph, and accordingly, though we know Roger and Rocks were enemies, we haven't seen that rivalry in action. God Valley is the climactic end to their struggle, and accordingly, if their last battle is simply the work of Imu's evil magic, Roger and Xebec would appear to have been only rivals for Shakky's affection. We would never see a true ideological divide between the two in action. Another possibility is that, should Eris tragically be killed, Xebec will simply snap and lose control, directing his rage indiscriminately toward innocent villagers on God Valley, prompting Roger and Garp's intervention. While this is at least a bit more plausible, I'm still not convinced it would fully explain Roger and Garp's need to form an alliance, allowing for the possibility that the imagery accompanying Sengoku's version of the story was simply inaccurate. We saw the rest of the Rock's crew standing at Xebec's back as they fought against Roger and Garp. While certainly a handful of the crew may still be intent on reclaiming Shakky, Kaido and Big Mom were most concerned with acquiring Devil Fruit, and none of them seemed particularly inclined toward indiscriminate slaughter of the Celestial Dragon's captives. Ultimately, I struggle to imagine, even with all of his faults, that Xebec would intentionally and indiscriminately target the innocent civilians of his hometown. I can imagine Eris' death causing him to go on a rampage against the Celestial Dragons, but see no reason his own clan would be caught in the crossfire demanding Roger's intervention. Essentially, I doubt Xebec turning on the Holy Knights would prompt Roger to step in and fight against Rocks, and although Roger would indeed defend the innocent civilians of God Valley, it seems highly implausible that under any circumstance that Xebec would attack them of his own volition, even in an enraged state. Which leads me back to the question if, despite Xebec's claim that his sole intent is to rescue his family, a sinister heel turn awaits, with Xebec and or another conspirator among the Davy clan set to reveal that the incident now unfolding serves Rock's ultimate goal of becoming World King. Remember, Xebec said he was seeking 2 Devil Fruit, including one hidden away on Elbaph, and there are 9 Devil Fruit being offered as prizes by the world government in this particular manhunt. What if Xebec used the Davy clan as bait for the world government and Celestial Dragons to bring the manhunt to God Valley, where he could then seize the other Devil Fruit he's been targeting? After all, we only know the identity of 2 of the 9 Devil Fruit, leaving 7 of them a mystery. Of course, there are some details that might not align for this theory to make sense. First, how would Xebec even know the date of the manhunt in order to arrive on time on God Valley? After all, as far as we know, Rox only found out because Ginny leaked the intel. But remember, there are other members of the Davy clan still on God Valley, so perhaps Xebec was instead counting on one of said clan members to alert him of the world government's arrival. However, I'm still not sure this plan would allow Xebec enough forewarning to arrive in time. Ginny sent notice 2 weeks in advance of the impending manhunt, whereas a fellow Davy clan member on the island wouldn't be able to inform Xebec that the incident was starting until the day of the government's arrival. Moreover, were they aware that the government was planning to hunt them, the Davy clan likely would have taken precaution to at least prevent themselves from being captured, and Xebec probably wouldn't have sent his own wife and son back to his homeland. It's also worth remembering that Garling said he discovered the Davy clan by a twist of fate, which again seems to point away from this discovery being orchestrated in any way by Xebec himself. Ultimately, Xebec's concern for his family seems completely genuine, and accordingly, it probably doesn't make sense that he would willingly put them in danger unless, as we discussed earlier, he's playing the so-called devil's game and made what he believed was a calculated bet using the lives of his family to claim his ultimate prize. With all that said, for the various counterpoints noted, I think it's unlikely Xebec intentionally orchestrated the incident on God Valley. I think his love for his family is genuine, and can't imagine him subjecting Eris and Teach to the horrors of the Celestial Dragon manhunt intentionally. Nor does this really seem to align with the details we've witnessed thus far. Yet, that seems to leave us without a satisfying answer to why Roger and Garp would make their final stand back-to-back against the Rock's pirates. Sengoku had no reason to exaggerate Roger's role. Any of the key figures being possessed by Imu has significant narrative and thematic issues, at least from my perspective. Xebec simply going berserk doesn't explain the fact that his crew seemingly remained by his side until the bitter end, and the events leading up to the incident don't really leave much room for Xebec to have plausibly orchestrated all of this as a means of entrapping the world government. Barring the extremely unlikely possibility of some way out of left field twist that Davy Jones' soul working through Xebec, or another yet to be seen and named member of the Davy clan, more sinister than Xebec, served as the true Machiavellian architect of the God Valley incident, nothing presented thus far seems to answer this key question about what motivates Roger, Xebec, and Garp's impending showdown. Which leads me to what I believe is potentially a likely answer. That fate has indeed assembled these forces on God Valley, has indeed given Xebec the opportunity to rescue his family, but may also present him with the object he most desires. Just as fate saved Blackbeard from a grisly death on Impel Down, perhaps Xebec will seize a sudden opportunity to take possession of the devil fruit he believes will be the key to sitting on the empty throne. Perhaps at that point, either drunk on power or overtaken by an awakened zone fruit, Xebec's true sinister ambitions will be brought to light, forcing Roger and Garp to unite and break apart the Rock's pirates at this critical juncture. Essentially, perhaps by a twist of fate, Xebec will discover the devil fruit he most desires on God Valley, and perhaps in pursuit of said devil fruit, or after having eaten it, he'll become a very grave threat, which needs to be directly opposed by Roger and Garp. Of course, there are probably many other possibilities I've neglected to mention, but fundamentally, I think it's essential that Roger and Garp's stand against Xebec be one predicated on their diverging views of morality and justice. Right now, Xebec's currently stated goals don't seem to put him on a collision course with the former Pirate King, which leads me to suspect that Xebec's goals are either more sinister than have yet been revealed, or will change over the course of the battle. I think it would be disappointing if Roger and Xebec's rivalry never reached a true climactic final battle. Were Xebec or Roger the victim of Imu's demonic possession, the two wouldn't have truly clashed over competing ideals on God Valley, but would have instead been puppeteered into battle by happenstance, with Shakky's kidnapping serving as a completely unrelated and unpredicted catalyst. The only way I could see a direct possession by Imu working is if Xebec willingly makes a Faustian bargain in order to negotiate for teacher Eris's life, or if, as we've discussed earlier, the Davy clan's unexplored history and the origins of the Davy backfight are directly related in some way to Imu's evil game, and thus predicated on a bargain struck long ago between Imu and Davy Jones himself. Xebec is susceptible to being flipped. Again, I don't think this would be a fully satisfying outcome, but at the very least could fit thematically with the story being told in this broader flashback centered on Harald. and could foreshadow the dark fate which awaits the man Xebec called the King of the Giant Oafs for aligning himself with the world government Xebec knows to be ruled by the evil Lord Imu. However, with all that said, I'm also not sure that Garp would be regarded as a hero or allowed to keep his job as a Marine if he fought directly against Imu and openly opposed the interests of the world's evil ruler by fighting a possessed Xebec. So, while I've offered some potential answers for what might ultimately trigger Roger and Xebec's climactic battle, most importantly, I think it's essential that both are equally fighting of their own volition in service of their own dreams, ambitions, or ideals. On that note, there's one final point I want to touch on. In Chapter 100, Dragon's first introduction to the series is accompanied by a quote from the former Pirate King Goldie Roger. "Dreams, an inherited strength of will, the destiny of an age. As long as people seek freedom in this life, these things will not vanish from the earth." Notably, we've never learned when these words were spoken, but I've long imagined that Roger delivered this speech at some critical moment when challenging the world's forces of darkness and oppression. In theories dating back to 2010, I've referred to this hypothetical moment as the Roger Incident, a key moment when Roger rose up to challenge the world's forces of darkness and advanced his thesis that the immutable forces of inherited will and dreams will persist as long as the world seeks freedom. Fueling this theory was Rayleigh's line from Chapter 507 that perhaps the Roger pirates, like the scholars of O'Hara, were too hasty, suggesting that Roger's crew had rashly taken action before the appointed time, and thus failed in their quest to enlighten and liberate the broader One Piece world. Yet surprisingly, we learned through Oden's flashback that following discovery of the One Piece and true history, Roger simply accepted without deliberation that he and his crew had simply arrived too early, and thus he disbanded the Roger Pirates before they ever took direct action against the world government, predicated on the truth they learned about the world's lost history. In retrospect, it would seem that Rayleigh's line from 507 can better be understood to read that Roger, like the scholars of O'Hara, was simply too early, especially knowing that there are prophecies like the one delivered by Madame Charlie and Toki of the appointed day when the world will be turned upside down. I now suspect that Roger's famous words from Chapter 100 may have been delivered on God Valley at the climactic moment of his showdown with Rock's, or rather Davy D. Xebec. Remember, at this point in the story, Roger has reached Lodestar Island and learned the importance of the road poneglyphs to both discovering the true hidden final island where the One Piece is located and uncovering the true history. He may not yet know the truth of the world, but he does know the lengths to which the world government is willing to go to cover up the history of the Void Century. He's also now directly witnessing the barbarity of the Suster Dragons on God Valley firsthand. This seems like it could be a prime moment for Roger to articulate his still formulating ideas on the world's quest for freedom, even if he doesn't yet fully understand the true nature of his enemy and the means by which those dark forces rose to power. Notably, Dragon is likely to witness Roger and Xebec's climactic battle. Shanks' mother asked Dragon to find a person with a good heart to raise her child, which makes it highly probable that Dragon intentionally chose Roger as Shanks' guardian based on the events he's about to see unfold. Given that this quote accompanied Dragon's introduction in Chapter 100, it can be surmised that these particular words spoken by Roger had a profound impact on Dragon, and accordingly, I wonder if this could be the very speech which prompted Dragon to recognize Roger as the kind-hearted man Shanks' mother asked him to find to raise her innocent child. This is also very likely Dragon's last day as a Marine, as he will soon go on to form the Freedom Fighters with Ivankov, and then later the Revolutionary Army with Kuma and Ginny. Accordingly, it would be fitting if these words spoken by Roger on God Valley inspired the formation of Dragon's Freedom Fighters before O'Hara later inspires their transformation into the RA. Now, a few final predictions and points of discussion before closing out the video. First, regardless of what prompts Roger, Garp, and Xebec's battle, it's unclear how Xebec is ultimately going to be killed, assuming he is in fact dead. It seems like a strong possibility that Garling will be the one to ultimately kill Xebec, distinguishing himself on God Valley as described in Chapter 1086. I could even imagine Garling stabbing Xebec in the back when he's already defeated or captured. Blackbeard's father being killed by Garling, father of Shanks, would only serve to underscore the bitter rivalry between these two in the present, and emphasize the fact that they're bound by fate to one day clash. On a related note, in Chapter 434, Whitebeard told Shanks that seeing his face makes his scars ache because he reminds him of that man. We've since learned that Whitebeard and Roger's rivalry was far more friendly in nature than was previously assumed. So while it would make sense that Whitebeard was talking about Roger in this scene, it seems unlikely he'd harbor such bitter resentment toward the former Pirate King. Accordingly, I wonder if Garling will at some point scar Whitebeard as the battle on God Valley progresses. In the background of Chapter 1096, we saw a member of the Rock's pirates wielding what appears to be the same three-clawed weapon that Blackbeard later wielded as a member of Whitebeard's crew, and then used to scar Shanks' eye. I wonder if perhaps, after seeing Garling strike down his father, young Teach will take possession of this weapon from the unnamed member of Rocks seen in Chapter 1096. I speculated that Xebec could be targeting one of the Devil Fruit being offered as a prize for the manhunt, or the Devil Fruit he's targeting could present itself to him as a twist of fate. I don't really have much in the way of speculation for what that Devil Fruit might be, though the Darkness Logia and of course Nika seem like plausible guesses. On that note, given the number of characters whose fates intersected on God Valley, I wonder if Nika could be on the island and yet again slip through the world government's grasp as it has for the past 8 centuries. We don't know the other Devil Fruit being offered as prizes, but given that nearly all of the world's current leading pirates have direct or indirect ties to God Valley, I wonder if Law could follow suit, with perhaps the Heart Fruit being offered as a prize. Buggy's only current connection to God Valley is indirectly through Roger and Captain John, though it's curious his bounty poster so closely matches Xebec's picture. I'm not saying I think there's a familial connection, but I do wonder if Buggy could have direct ties somehow to God Valley, considering he's nearly the same age as Teach and Shanks. It would seem there are likely 11 other members of the Davy clan currently living on God Valley, besides Teach and Xebec, which makes me wonder if any of them will survive, perhaps rescued by Kuma after he acquires the Paw Fruit. Accordingly, we're left to speculate if any other characters in the story could unknowingly be related to the Davy clan. I mentioned Buggy, though I personally think that's unlikely, but the identities of characters like Luffy's mother and Robin's father still remain unknown, and thus could potentially be surviving members of the Davy clan. There are still a ton of things to discuss about God Valley, but I'll leave things here for now. I think the biggest unanswered question is what will prompt Roger and Xebec's climactic battle, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please leave a like, but of course, most importantly, I'd love to read your thoughts down in the comments.